Eddie Hernandez says, if America is so great, why is the U.S. dollar so weak? The Europeans are much happier than us, and the euro has more purchasing power. Well, Eddie, that's a complex question, so let's get started. If America is so great, why is the U.S. dollar so weak? For most of the history of the U.S. dollar, the dollar was the best currency in the world, sound as a dollar. Dollar was a private form of paper money. It was originally called the Dutch thaler. And the thaler, like many of the other private monies, there were private monies out there. Individual banks, individual holdings, individual cartels and groups had their own money. And one of them was a Dutch holding bank, and they issued piece of paper called a thaler, and the thaler was sound. It had plenty of resources. You could take a paper thaler and exchange it for actual genuine gold, and that became the dollar, and sound as a dollar was the appropriate description of the U.S. currency for most of the currency lifetime. Dollar was great because it was based on gold, and you can't print gold. You can only print money. And the more money you print, the less the money is worth. So America started getting into trouble when we started to have things like the Federal Reserve Bank and so on and so forth. The gold standard is a tricky subject, and I'll be perfectly honest with you, I don't know quite enough about that. I'm certainly in favor of the gold standard on ideological purposes. There's an argument to be made that the economy exploded much faster than the amount of gold in the world, that you in fact need more money than gold can produce, or that gold can represent, can be exchanged for, without degrading the value of everything. And so there's arguments to be made there. But the short form of your answer, Eddie, is that the dollar has become weak recently because of the welfare state. Because people want to be given things for free, and they'll vote for politicians who will spend money that we don't have. 40% of all of the expenditures that the United States makes right now are 40 cents on the dollar is 40 cents that we don't have. And every single year, we put another 40 cents for every dollar we spend we don't have, and we owe it, and it gets more and more and more and more and more. So the answer is, yes, it's true. The dollar is weak because we have a wretched and horrible political class who has no sense of the future, no sense of long-term, no sense of integrity, no sense of honor, courage, decency, or anything. They will exchange their honor and their sense of the future of the country in exchange for another 2 years or 6 years of feeding at the public trough and being called the honorable this and riding around in big cars that they couldn't afford otherwise, or having political power to get themselves the businesses that they would not be able to maintain otherwise. So that doesn't make us unique, but that's what happened. And really, once you start the progressive movement, once you start talking about social benefits, then you start talking about the government providing social benefits, then you run into trouble because unlike private citizens, like a church, let's say, wanted to provide benefits for its congregation. What a swell idea that is. Let's just say there's a socialist collective church and they want to take enormous amounts of money from their congregation and use that money to disperse equally among the members of the congregation and make sure nobody was out in the cold and everything was cool and everybody in the church agreed. And if you didn't like it, you could leave and go to another church, and other people who did like it would come to this church. So far, so good. But the difference between that church and the government is the church can't print their own money. The church can only disperse what it takes in, and that means it's fundamentally sound. But when you've got a government doing that instead of a church, and it's taking in $1 and it wants to pay out $2, well, then it takes in $1 and hands that back out, prints another $1, and there you go. And then suddenly the currency becomes worth less. And as it continues to become worth less and worth less and worth less, pretty soon it's worthless. And that's where we're heading. And we're virtually there. Now, as far as the second part of the question, I'm not convinced that the Europeans are happier than the U.S. It's no question that the people in Scandinavia have a higher level of happiness than Americans do. But a higher level of happiness than what part of America? First of all, you have, when you talk about Norway or Sweden's happiness, are we fully accounting for the happiness of the unassimilated Muslim parts of those countries, and France and so on? Are we counting them? Are they happy? And also, when we talk about happier than the U.S., happier than 300 million people, 100 million of which are in a state of perpetual dependency. If you were to ask conservatives about their state of happiness, you'd find that if you just polled American conservatives, you'd find that America was the happiest place in the world by a wide margin. So you got to take that into account too, because American conservatives are happy because we have the sense that our destiny is under our control. I read a really interesting article 2 days ago about the mortality rates in Russia, and that Russia mortality is 10 years, 15 years almost now lower than it was during the Soviet Union. And alcoholism is rampant, and number of industrial accidents, people just being killed in, in helicopter crashes and train collapses and all this other stuff. So the question was, why is Russian mortality so high? And they looked at it, compared to economic periods of growth, and they looked at it during the Soviet Union, they looked at it after the fall of the Soviet Union, and they couldn't find a correlation. They only found 2 periods of time when Russian mortality declined significantly. And those 2 times were in the Khrushchev thaw after the death of Stalin. Khrushchev, after Stalin died in 1953, there was probably a 6-year, 7-year interregnum, and then Khrushchev comes to power, and he starts liberalizing the country. And at that point, Russian mortality went down. The number of surviving people went up. Alcoholism went down, accidents went down, all that other stuff. The other time it went down in Russia was right after the collapse of the Soviet Union in the early 90s, when it looked like they may be able to transition to a capitalist economy, and before all the kleptocracy took over, which resulted in the counter-reformation of Putin and all the authority and so on. There's only 2 times in the history of the modern Russia where the Russian mortality rate has gone down. Now listen carefully, because as the point, Eddie, was during those 2 brief periods where the Russian people had a sense of hope. They had a sense of hope, actual hope, not this nonsense crap that was posted on billboards to cover power grabs and mediocrity. Actual hope. What did those 2 periods, when the mortality rate in the Russian Federation and the Soviet Union go down, what did those 2 periods have in common in terms of hope? Those were the 2 periods in modern Russian history, and the only 2 periods in modern Russian history, where Russian people thought that they might have a chance to be the masters of their own destiny, period, full stop, end of sentence. That's it. So when you talk about happiness, I don't know. I mean, there's a certain amount of happiness to be derived, I suppose, from not having to worry about whether or not you're going to be able to make your rent for that month. But I'm telling you, it is not equivalent to the amount of happiness that comes with being able to become the person you want to be. I have not ever met a happy Scandinavian, not in America anyway. I've met contented Scandinavians, and that's really the word for them, I think, because I don't think we're really talking about happiness here. I think we're talking about contentedness. We're certainly not talking about euphoria or joy, because if you're talking about joy, you got a whole different aspect going here. I don't think I've ever met an uncontented Scandinavian, and I've never met somebody who I would consider actually happy in the way I know happy Americans. They're contented. In fact, P.G. O'Rourke or somebody was talking about this. I think somebody was talking about there's a word in either Swedish or Norwegian, and it's the term they use if somebody has a dinner party, and you go to the dinner party and you ask the guests, "How did you enjoy the dinner party?" And the word they use is, "It was sufficient." Just enough is the word they're using. Just enough. Was enough to eat so that I'm not hungry, but it wasn't extravagant, it wasn't crazy, it wasn't. That's pretty much the Scandinavian thing. Sufficient, just enough. So if you're telling me that the Greeks are happier than Americans, I don't know if I buy it, and I don't know if I buy any of this stuff. I just think that happiness and economic freedom are related. There's no question the American dollar has been destroyed by printing all this money. I can't argue with you there. I wish I could. And to say the euro has more purchasing power, you have to understand something about this euro business and this giant lie that is the EU. And the best way to look at the lie that's the EU, Eddie, is to say, which one is it? Because if you look at Wikipedia for the largest economy in the world, you'll see number 1 is the EU. It's the biggest economy in the world. It's bigger than America. And then as you go down the list of the EU, United States, China, down the list, then all of a sudden you see Germany, and then you see Britain, and then you see France, and then you see Italy. So which one is it? Is it Italy or is it the EU? If it's the EU, there should be no entry for Britain or Germany or Italy or France. And if it's not, if there is in fact a French economy, then the EU is not really deserving of the biggest economy in the world. And I'm not the first person to say this, and I don't think it's going to take a whole lot more convincing. The EU is being held together by unelected, supranational political strings. But if you actually think that the Germans and the Greeks can agree on anything, then you got another thing coming. It's just a matter of time until this thing falls apart. I don't think it's that much time. The Germans are working like crazy to pay for the Greeks goofing off. It's just like here in America, except we don't call them Germans and Greeks. But we have Germans and Greeks here. We have people who work very hard and are disciplined and hardworking and productive and have foresight and plan and all that other stuff. Then we have a bunch of people who just basically want to drink kuzu all day and kick back and, enjoy the sun. So we'll see. I got a pretty good feeling that weak though the dollar is, there'll be a dollar longer than there will be a euro. I got a real strong feeling that'll be the case. And the reason is because this is an actual nation and the European Union isn't a nation. And we weren't a nation before the Civil War, but we've been fighting now as a group, these 50 states, long enough so that we're a nation. The United States, the difference between Oklahoma and Alabama is trivial compared to the difference between Norway and Portugal. So